Okay, so this video is going to take you through Unit 4.9, Barriers to Development. It's a big topic, I mean, as is 4.10, the strategies. But it's a really important topic for both Paper 1 and probably more so, actually, Paper 2. The thing about the barriers to entry is a whole list. I mean, there's probably about 18 of them that might be listed in your syllabus, and I couldn't possibly go through all of them. The cycle of poverty is the only diagram that you can really draw if you've got a question that is solely about development. I mean, you can certainly add ASAD diagrams, but this diagram here is the only one you're going to come across. And you can adapt it to your own use. So depending upon the sort of question you've got, I would encourage you to try and use a poverty cycle to illustrate the problem, the barrier. You can put any barrier in here. If you start with low income, low savings, you can come around and talk about any of the barriers that are listed here that bring you back around to low income, and so you get into this cycle of poverty that is shown typically in any poverty cycle diagram. Here's another one that's just got low access to food and safe water, bringing on hunger, malnutrition, depleted workforce, and again, economic decline. This one's about education and funding for schools. Right? So you can use those, and you should use those where you can. Here's a list of the economic barriers. So this is one of our lists, and again, there's probably about 10 of them on here. And you need to know, again, you need to know all of them, know something about it, and probably your textbook is the best source material for many of these barriers. Just to show you on this slide, there's two examples here of questions. There's this one from November 22, Paper 2, and as I say, this is probably the most common place that you'll find a question about this particular section of the syllabus. So this one was about Tanzania. A very typical question, knowledge of economics, information from the text. Discuss the different barriers to economic growth and to economic development. So it's often growth and development in Paper 2. If you watch my video on Paper 2, you'll see me go into that in a bit more detail. But this one's specifically focused on the different barriers that Tanzania faces from the case study material that you're given. You also find it in Paper 1. You know, the third question in Paper 1 is going to be on Unit 4, Global Economy. Here's a question from Unit 1. Discuss the view that the weak institutional framework in many economically least developed countries represents the most significant barrier to economic growth. So this is an interesting question because, you know, you're not going to be expected necessarily to know all of the barriers, but with this question, the focus is on institutional framework, so you definitely need to know what that is. But then the discussion in this question is going to be on the extent to which institutional framework is the most significant barrier. So you can bring in any of the other barriers, maybe 3, 4, 5 maximum of the other barriers in order to help answer that question. Some of the barriers, I mean, I'll talk about maybe they're more important than others, like this over-dependence on primary goods is significant because primary goods tend to be income and price inelastic. They've got low value added. So if that's all you sell, it's very difficult for you to progress beyond a certain level of income. You know, the countries that have been successful in developing, if we look at South Korea as a very, very good example of that, it came in the 1950s from a position that was very similar to African countries at that time to be one of the richest economies of the world. And it didn't do it by being dependent upon primary goods. It diversified into manufacturing as quickly as possible. In this narrow range of exports problem, South Korea quickly got away from that so that they were able to sell a wide variety of goods because, you know, a narrow range of exports makes you vulnerable. It's very difficult to increase your living standard if that's all you do, particularly if it's on agriculture. Similarly, this access to international markets is crucial for developing countries, and they often face tariff protectionism, tariff escalation on many of their goods, which makes life difficult for them. There's a whole range of sort of smaller things about the structural diversity of the countries, the size, its historical background, its access to resources, the composition of its workforce, in terms of the split between public and private sectors, and political structure, interest groups, corruption we'll come on to in a moment, income distribution in general. So there's a load of factors that you should really explore in relation to that. There's education and health, and that significant link to human capital, and how education can improve the quality of the human capital is an integral part for many countries. Appropriate technology is mentioned as well. New technology is crucial, but it has to be, this word appropriate is there for a reason. It's got to be something that is affordable and fits into the country that we're talking about. Highly sophisticated technology in agriculture is not necessarily the way forward at the moment for many of these developing countries. There's financial issues in terms of indebtedness, capital flight, and currency conversion. So debt has been a major factor, and you've probably studied that in detail, the debt crisis from the 1980s, and the hangover that still applies with many African countries that exist today. And it makes life very difficult. Being in debt is not a problem. Developed countries have thrived on being in debt, but they're in a position where they can service that debt. Being in debt is a problem when you can't afford to repay the debts, and you can't afford, therefore, to then buy anything else. If the majority of your income earnings from exports, perhaps, is going in debt repayment, that doesn't enable you to invest in your future. So, lots of reasons why countries do borrow to fill the savings and foreign exchange gaps that you've probably come across as well. The shortfall that these countries have in terms of the amount of money that's saved and the amount of money they can earn from the sale of their exports in terms of foreign exchange makes life difficult for them. And there's often plenty of places that they can go in order to get this money. So there's a bit about servicing the debt and the country's liquidity. And of course, we've had various calls to reduce the debt burden over the years. It's been going on since the debt crisis started, and we still seem to have that problem. Capital liberalisation, again, liberalisation is often tied in with the Washington Consensus and the view to move towards a more sort of free market approach, has pros and cons in terms of currency convertibility to enable you to be engaged in global trade. This problem of capital flight, where money flows out of the country because of the risk of keeping it there. Again, those funds are no longer available for the domestic economy, so these problems will materialise from it. And the same is true in human capital flight as well. Then we've got another list away from the economic barriers of the political and social barriers, and there at the top there you see that weak institutional framework, which was asked in that question in paper 1. Tied in with it, the legal system, ineffective tax structures, the banking system in general, property rights, gender inequality, the corruption thing that I mentioned earlier, the inequality of power and status. All of those things you really just need to read up on in your textbooks and get some sort of case study material on it. There's a few slides here that's giving you some information, which you can sort of pause the video and take note of. I think corruption is a big issue, actually, and it's difficult for us necessarily to talk about it. But to have a corrupt economy makes life very difficult for people, primarily in Africa. So it filters down throughout society. If it's endemic within that country, very hard for them to break away from it. The various armed conflicts that are still going on. Here's some from 2019. Many of these armed conflicts are still going today. The empowerment of women and education of women in general as well. A crucial sort of section in terms of creating another barrier. So it's a big topic, it's a big area, hopefully one that you'll read up on, but there's an overview for you which I hope you find useful.